The gun was already in Lionel Walker's hand when he heard her laugh. Not a nervous laugh. Not the kind of hollow, desperate sound a person makes when they are staring down the barrel of the most feared man in the New Mexico territory. It was full and bright and entirely unguarded, and it rang out across the dusty floor of the Silver Spur Saloon like a church bell in the middle of a funeral. And Lionel Walker, who had not lowered his weapon for any man, woman, marshal, or act of God in 11 years, felt his trigger finger go absolutely, traitorously still. He had come to this saloon for one reason. The man sitting across from Rosa Hawthorne, the sweating, red-faced man in the city suit who had slapped a leather satchel down on the table between them, that man owed Lionel something that went far beyond money. He owed him a reckoning. He owed him 5 years of silence while an innocent person rotted in a territorial prison. He owed him the kind of debt that could only be settled with a confession or a grave, and Lionel had walked through the bat-wing doors of the Silver Spur on the evening of September the 3rd, 1882, intending to collect on exactly that. But Rosa Hawthorne had laughed. She had laughed because the man in the city suit had apparently said something profoundly, embarrassingly foolish, something about the train schedules from Santa Fe, and she had found it so genuinely ridiculous that the laugh just came out of her, helpless and honest, and it had struck Lionel Walker somewhere behind his sternum with the force of a physical blow. He stood in the doorway, the evening light bleeding orange behind him, his reputation preceding him the way a storm precedes itself with a change in pressure. Every other head in the saloon had turned. Every other body had gone rigid. Men who had never met Lionel Walker personally still knew to stop breathing when that particular silhouette appeared in a doorway, because his name traveled faster than he did, and the stories that clung to it were not gentle ones. He had killed 4 men in fair fights, which in the territory of 1882 was enough to qualify a person as a legend. He had tracked a gang of cattle rustlers for 3 weeks through the Jornado del Muerto without resupply and brought them in, 2 living and 1 decidedly not. And the marshal in Las Cruces had shaken his hand and then quietly asked him to leave town before sundown. He had done things in his past, real things, dark things built from betrayal and survival, and choices made under pressure that no clean version of a man would ever have to make. And the weight of those things lived in the set of his jaw and the flatness of his gray eyes and the particular way he moved, which was less like walking and more like weather. The room had gone silent. Every man at every table had located the nearest wall or the nearest exit, and Rosa Hawthorne still had not stopped laughing. She finally looked up, pressing her fingers against her mouth as if she could push the last of it back in, and her dark eyes found Lionel Walker standing in the doorway with a gun in his hand and a look on his face that made grown men weep. And she blinked, and she said with absolute perfect composure, "Are you going to stand there holding that thing, or are you going to sit down? Because Wendell here is about to tell me the train leaves at 9:30, and I strongly suspect he means in the morning, and this is going to require a second opinion." Wendell, the man in the city suit, went the color of old chalk. Lionel Walker put the gun back in its holster. He did not sit down, not immediately, but the fact that the gun went back in the holster at all was something that would be talked about in Cuervo, New Mexico for the next 30 years. He had come to that saloon carrying a secret so heavy it had bent his spine. He had come carrying the truth about a hidden motive, about a betrayal so complete and so carefully constructed that it had cost him everything he had once imagined his life could be. He had come because Wendell Pratt, sitting there in his city suit with his leather satchel, was the man who had lied to a judge, who had forged documents, who had handed over a name that was not guilty, so that a name that was, his own, could walk free and keep moving west and keep building the kind of power that men like Wendell Pratt built on the foundations of other people's suffering. And something about the sound of a woman laughing without fear in a room full of fear had reached into the machinery of that reckoning, and jammed a very significant gear. Lionel Walker pulled out a chair and sat down. He had been 20 years old the first time he crossed into New Mexico territory, riding a horse named Jasper that he had won in a card game in El Paso, carrying a bedroll, a rifle, and about $40 in worn paper money. That was 1871. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith who believed in hard work and not much else, and he had come west because the East felt like a room that was slowly closing in on him. Not dramatically, not violently. Just incrementally, wall by wall, the way a life can narrow around a person when they are born into a circumstance that was never designed to expand. He had worked honest work for 3 years. Line riding for a cattle outfit north of Roswell, mending fence, moving cattle, sleeping under stars so brilliant and so indifferent that they had cured him of several illusions about his own importance in the world. He had been good at it. He had been reliable and quiet, and he had sent a portion of his wages back to his mother in Missouri without fail until the winter of 1873, when she passed of a fever that the local physician had not been competent enough to treat in time. After that, he had no one to send money to, and no particular reason to remain reliable in the ways that other people required of him. That was when he had met Wendell Pratt. Pratt had come west from Kansas City with capital and ambition, and a talent for identifying men who had skills that were not entirely legal, and who had recently lost their last tether to conventional behavior. He had recruited Lionel into what he called a land acquisition operation, which was a phrase that covered a great many sins. They had moved water rights. They had pressured small ranchers. They had done things that Lionel had told himself were not truly wrong because no one had been physically hurt, which was a lie he had been able to maintain for about 2 years before it became untenable. When it became untenable, Lionel had tried to walk away. Walking away from Wendell Pratt was not simple, because Pratt was the kind of man who believed that knowing the truth about a person was a form of currency, and he had been collecting it on Lionel since the day they met. When Lionel said he was done, Pratt had smiled the particular smile of a man who holds cards he has not yet played, and said that if Lionel walked, a certain judge in Santa Fe would receive a certain document implicating Lionel in a land fraud that had actually been orchestrated entirely by Pratt himself. Lionel had walked anyway, because there is a point at which a person's dignity demands it even when their survival argues against it. He had been arrested 3 weeks later. The document was real, or real enough, and it was accompanied by the testimony of 2 men who worked for Pratt and who had apparently decided that loyalty was more valuable than truth. The judge in Santa Fe had been the kind of judge who responded well to the kind of influence that Pratt was capable of exercising, and Lionel Walker had spent 18 months in the territorial prison in Santa Fe before a combination of circumstances. A different judge, a witness who had quietly recanted, and the fact that Pratt had gotten greedy enough to make a different enemy who had the resources to expose him, had resulted in Lionel's release. He had come out of that prison carrying a darkness that had not been there before, or rather, a darkness that had been there in seed form and had found, in 18 months of confinement and injustice, exactly the conditions it needed to grow. He had not gone looking for revenge immediately. He had spent 3 years working honest work again, or close to honest, mostly tracking, some guiding, some work for a couple of different operations that were not entirely above board but were not actively harmful either. He had built a reputation, partly by necessity and partly because in the territory of the late 1870s, a man without a reputation was a man without protection. And so he had allowed certain stories about himself to be told without correcting them and had occasionally done things that confirmed them. And the result was Lionel Walker, the most feared man in the New Mexico territory, which was a title he wore with the same feeling one wears an old coat. Useful. Familiar. Not particularly comfortable anymore. He had tracked Wendell Pratt for 2 years before finding him in Cuervo. And now, He was sitting across from him, and a woman named Rosa Hawthorne who laughed without fear, and the reckoning he had traveled 200 miles to deliver was sitting on pause in a way that made no logical sense to him whatsoever. Rosa was watching him with the direct, clear-eyed attention of someone who was not in the habit of pretending not to see things. She had a face that was striking rather than conventionally pretty, strong bones and dark eyes, and a mouth that seemed to naturally tend toward expression. Her hair was dark brown and pinned up in the practical way of a woman who had work to do, but had also taken the 30 seconds required to do it with a certain care. She wore a blue dress that was clean but not new, the kind of dress a working woman owns because it is sensible and not because it is fashionable. Wendell Pratt was trying to make himself smaller, which for a man of his particular build was a geometrically challenging enterprise. "You two know each other," Rosa said. It was not quite a question. "We have a history," Lionel said. His voice came out quieter than he expected, because he was still slightly off balance from the laugh, and when he was off balance his instinct was to become very still and very quiet rather than to compensate. "The kind of history that requires a gun," Rosa said, "or the kind that just feels that way." Lionel looked at her. "What kind of business do you have with this man? That is a personal matter. So is mine." Rosa glanced between them with the expression of a woman performing rapid calculations. She said, "Wendell, why don't you go wait at the bar?" And her tone carried a particular authority that was interesting given that Wendell Pratt outweighed her by a significant margin and theoretically had no obligation to follow her instructions. Wendell went to the bar. Rosa leaned back in her chair and studied Lionel Walker with the kind of scrutiny that made most men uncomfortable, because it was not afraid of what it might find. "You are Lionel Walker," she said. "Yes. I have heard things about you. Most of them are probably true. The one about the 3 men in Tucson, that one is mostly exaggerated." A small smile moved at the corner of her mouth. "So only 2 of them were completely your fault." He felt something shift, very small, very contained, in the locked room at the center of his chest. "Who are you?" "Rosa Hawthorne. I am a schoolteacher." "Or I was. Until the school board in Albuquerque decided that a woman who held her own opinions was a more significant threat to public order than the 14 men in this territory who are wanted by actual law enforcement agencies." She said this without bitterness, which somehow made it worse than bitterness would have. "I came to Cuervo because a friend of mine wrote to say there might be a need for a teacher here, and because I needed to be somewhere that Albuquerque was not. What is your business with Pratt? He owns the building that might house the new school. I have been trying to negotiate a lease." She paused. "He keeps telling me the train from Santa Fe will bring the proper paperwork soon, and tonight I finally understood that the train from Santa Fe is not going to bring anything useful, because Wendell Pratt does not actually intend to lease me that building." Another pause. "What is your business with him?" Lionel looked at her for a long moment. He said, "He lied, cost me 2 years of my life and considerably more than that. You want him to admit it. I want him to correct it. There are records, documents. His testimony to a judge in Santa Fe would clear something that needs to be cleared." Rosa was quiet for a moment, looking at the table surface between them. Then she said, "That is not a small thing to ask for." "No. Is that what the gun was for?" "Persuasion." Lionel was quiet. "Mr. Walker," Rosa said, and her voice was not gentle exactly, but it was not hard either. It was something in between, something that felt like being spoken to by a person who intended to tell you the truth regardless of whether it was welcome. "If you shoot Wendell Pratt, you will not get the documents corrected. You will get a shallow grave and a short story, and the record will stay exactly as it is. I am assuming," she added, "that the matter you want cleared is not the sort of thing that can be cleared posthumously." He looked at her. She was entirely correct, and the fact that she had laid it out in approximately 45 words where he had spent 2 years constructing elaborate justifications for a course of action that she had just efficiently dismantled was slightly galling. "You have a proposal," he said. I have a thought. I do not know your situation well enough to have a proposal. She folded her hands on the table. But I am a person who believes, probably to a fault, that problems which look like they can only be solved through violence very rarely actually require violence, and that the shortage of people willing to think carefully is a larger contributor to violence in this territory than the shortage of moral fiber, which is what everyone else says is the problem. She looked at him steadily. Tell me what you need from Wendell Pratt, and let us see what we can figure out. Lionel Walker, who had ridden 200 miles through desert country to settle a score through force, and who had not asked for anyone's assistance in approximately 11 years, told Rosa Hawthorne what he needed. It took a while. It was not a simple story. And as he told it, watching her face receive it with intelligence and steady attention, something that had been locked for a very long time began, imperceptibly, to loosen. It took them until nearly midnight to work out the shape of a plan. Wendell Pratt had been brought back to the table at Rosa's instruction, and what he had found when he arrived was less the reckoning he had been dreading and more a negotiation, which was in some ways more terrifying because he could not tell where the edges of it were. Rosa was the one who laid it out for him, in clear, plain language, while Lionel sat very still and said nothing, which was more effective than any threat could have been because the silence of Lionel Walker in a room was its own category of menace. What Pratt would do was this. He would provide a written statement, witnessed and notarized in the morning, correcting his testimony in the Santa Fe matter. He would address the letter to Judge Harrison Alcott, who had presided over the original case and who was still sitting on the territorial bench. He would hand it over to Lionel by noon the following day. What he would receive in return was the opportunity to continue breathing and conducting his business affairs without interference from Lionel Walker, which, given the alternative, turned out to be worth considerably more to him than the effort of writing an honest statement. Rosa also, in the course of this negotiation, extracted from Wendell Pratt a lease agreement for the building on Mesa Street, at a rate that was fair, and for a term of 5 years. She did this so smoothly, folding it into the larger terms as though it were a natural and obvious component of the arrangement, that Pratt had signed it before he fully understood that it had not been part of the original conversation. When Pratt had gone, sweating and deflated, to his room at the boarding house across the street, Lionel and Rosa were left at the table with 2 glasses and a nearly empty bottle of rye whiskey that the barkeep had provided in a spirit of either hospitality or self-preservation. Lionel poured 2 fingers into each glass. "You did not have to do that," he said. "Which part?" "The lease. You could have made that a separate matter." "I could have." Rosa picked up her glass. "But I find that when you have someone's complete and earnest attention, it is efficient to address multiple things at once." He looked at her. "You were not afraid of Wendell Pratt. He is a man whose entire power rests on other people's willingness to be afraid of him, which means it is not real power at all." She met his eyes. "Of you? Slightly. In the beginning." "What changed?" She considered this. "You sat down," she said. "A man who sits down when he could do the other thing is generally worth talking to." The silver spur had emptied considerably. The barkeep was wiping glasses with the focused attention of a man pretending very hard not to listen. Outside Cuervo, New Mexico was settling into its nighttime quiet, which was the quiet of a small desert town in 1882, not peaceful exactly but tired, the particular exhaustion of a place that is working very hard to become something while not being entirely sure what. "Where will you go?" Rosa asked. "After Santa Fe, when the record is corrected." "I have not thought that far." She tilted her head. "You spent 2 years tracking this down and you have not thought about what comes after." "The after felt theoretical," he said. It was more honest than he had intended to be. Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think when people have been wronged very deeply, they sometimes focus so completely on the reckoning that they forget to build anything on the other side of it. Because building something requires a certain kind of hope, and hope is a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities are dangerous." She looked at her glass. I'm not saying that as a judgment. I recognize it because I have done the same thing. He looked at her. The school board in Albuquerque, among other things. She did not elaborate and he did not push. My point is that you should think about it. What comes after? You seem like a person who would be quite good at things, given the right direction. Lionel Walker had been called many things in his life. Good at things, given the right direction, was not among them, and it landed with a strange, warm weight. They talked for another hour. It was not strategic talking, not the kind that served a purpose beyond itself. It was the kind of talking that happens when two people who are each, in their own way, somewhat lonely and somewhat braced against the world find that the bracing is, in the presence of the other person, slightly less necessary than usual. He learned that she was 28, 2 years younger than him. That she had grown up in Santa Fe, the daughter of a Mexican mother and an Anglo father, in a household that had given her the experience of belonging to two worlds while being considered entirely at home in neither, which she described as clarifying, in the way that discomfort often was. That she had trained as a teacher in Albuquerque and had taught there for 4 years before her opinions about the curriculum, specifically about teaching the children of Spanish-speaking families in a way that respected rather than suppressed their language and their history, had become more than the school board was willing to accommodate. He told her things he had not told anyone. Not in the careful summary way he had told her about Pratt, but in the small specific way that means more. The horse named Jasper, his mother's hands, rough from laundry work, the particular quality of the silence in the Santa Fe prison at 3 in the morning that he still sometimes heard when he was in a quiet room. At some point, the barkeep put out most of the lamps and went to bed, leaving one burning on the bar out of either courtesy or negligence. "I should go," Rosa said. She did not move. "Where are you staying?" "The boarding house, Mrs. Alvarado's on the north side of town." "I'll walk with you." She looked at him with a slight smile. "You are going to protect me from the dangers of Cuervo, New Mexico at midnight." "It seems more likely," he said, "that you would protect yourself from the dangers of Cuervo, New Mexico at midnight. I am simply going in the same direction." Her smile widened into something full and unguarded, and there it was again, that quality of brightness, not quite the laugh but related to it. The same animal, and Lionel Walker felt the same precise thing he had felt in the doorway. The complete and slightly disorienting suspension of everything he had been carrying. They walked in the warm September night, the stars enormous and indifferent overhead, the dirt streets soft under their feet. The town was made of adobe and wood and ambition, a collection of buildings that had appeared in the last decade as the territory expanded, each one a bet that this particular place would turn into something lasting. At the gate of Mrs. Alvarado's boarding house, Rosa turned to face him. "Tomorrow," she said, "noon, the notary is on Main Street. I know where it is. Lionel." It was the first time she had used his name, and she said it without the Mr., which was a small choice that felt like a significant one. "Whatever happens with the statement and with Santa Fe, I am glad you sat down tonight instead of doing the other thing." He looked at her in the dark. "So am I," he said. "More than I expected." She went inside. He stood at the gate for a moment in the warm night air, with the smell of desert sage and the sound of nothing but wind, and something he had not felt in a very long time was moving through him, new and strange and tender as a wound that is beginning, finally, to heal. He did not sleep well, but not for the reasons he usually did not sleep well. Morning in Cuervo came in gold and pink, the sky doing what desert skies do, performing a kind of extravagant beauty that seemed disproportionate to the audience available. Lionel was up at dawn, which was habit, and he walked to the livery to check on his horse, a gray-named colt who was steady and opinionated, and had carried him across more difficult country than any horse had a reasonable right to be grateful for. He fed Colt an apple he had procured from the general store the previous evening, and stood in the cool morning smell of the livery, thinking. The thinking was complicated because it contained Rosa Hawthorne in a way that thinking had not recently contained anyone, and he was not entirely sure what to do with that. He went to the hotel, washed up, changed his shirt. He ate breakfast at a small place near the edge of Main Street that served eggs and biscuits and strong coffee, and he sat with his back to the wall in the long-established habit of a man who had learned that the people who were likely to want to shoot him came from the front. At 9 in the morning, something happened that changed the shape of the day considerably. A rider came into town from the east, hard riding, a man on a dark horse, and he pulled up in front of the hotel and went inside with the urgent body language of someone delivering news. Within 20 minutes, that news had spread in the way that news spreads in small towns, which is faster and more comprehensively than any communication system that had yet been invented. The news was that a man named Curtis Doyle was in the territory with a small crew, moving toward Cuervo. Curtis Doyle was a name that connected to Lionel's history, the way a scar connects to a wound. He was a man who had worked for Pratt in the years when Lionel had also worked for Pratt, a man who had been one of the two witnesses who had given false testimony to the judge in Santa Fe, and who had spent the intervening years doing increasingly ugly work for increasingly dangerous people. He was also a man who had reason to know that if Lionel Walker ever got Pratt to produce a corrected statement, that statement would contain not just Pratt's confession, but specific details about the men who had supported his lie, men like Curtis Doyle. He was not coming to Cuervo to admire the scenery. Lionel was at Rosa's boarding house within 15 minutes of hearing the news. She answered the door with a cup of coffee in her hand and the alert, unsurprised look of someone who had already heard. "I know," she said, stepping back to let him in. "Mrs. Alvarado's nephew brought word from the livery." The front sitting room of the boarding house was clean and simply furnished, the kind of room that communicated respectability without pretension. Lionel sat in a chair by the window where he could see the street. Rosa sat across from him, and she was calm in the way that was beginning to feel characteristic of her, not the false calm of someone suppressing fear, but the genuine calm of someone who is afraid and has decided not to let fear drive. "How far out?" she asked. "Couple hours, maybe less depending on their pace. There are 3 of them according to the rider, 3 men against you. Those are not interesting odds in the territory." She looked at him. "That is not bravado." "You actually believe that?" "My reputation has a practical value," he said. "Doyle knows what I'm capable of. He will likely try something indirect before he tries anything direct." "Which means he will go after the thing you came here for," Rosa said immediately. "The statement. He will try to get to Pratt before noon." Lionel nodded. "Then we go now," Rosa said. She stood up and set down her coffee with the decisiveness of a person who has made a calculation and seen no value in further deliberation. "It is not safe for you to be Lionel." She said his name with the same unceremonious precision as the night before. "Wendell Pratt will not produce that statement for you alone. You saw how last night worked. He responds to me differently than he responds to you, because I am not holding a gun and I have something he wants, specifically his sense of himself as a reasonable businessman rather than a man being coerced by the most feared gunfighter in the territory." She picked up a small leather bag from the hallway table. "That statement is the correcting of a serious injustice, and I have a personal and professional interest in correcting injustices. So we go now." He looked at her for a moment, and what he felt was something he recognized from the night before, the loosening of something that had been locked, and beneath that a warmth that was new and slightly alarming in its intensity. "We go now," he agreed. The notary in Cuervo was a man named Herbert Foss, a small, careful, ink-stained man who took his professional responsibility very seriously, and who was already opening his office for the morning when Lionel and Rosa arrived, followed shortly by a considerably less energetic Wendell Pratt, who had been collected from his boarding house by Rosa, with the efficient purposefulness of a woman who intends to conclude her business before the complications arrive. The drafting of the statement took 45 minutes. Rosa sat at Herbert Foss's small conference table with Wendell Pratt and guided the language with a teacher's precision, making sure every relevant detail was included, every date, every name, every specific act of falsehood, in language clear enough that no judge would be able to misunderstand it and specific enough that it would hold up to scrutiny. Lionel stood by the window. When Pratt began to equivocate on one of the specifics, Lionel simply turned from the window and looked at him, and Pratt's equivocation resolved itself with remarkable speed. The statement was signed, witnessed, and sealed by 10:30 in the morning. Lionel held it in his hands for a moment. Years of carrying the weight of a false record, of a name associated with a crime he had not committed, of the kind of hidden stain that shapes everything around it, and it was now in his hands in the form of 8 pages of careful legal language and one frightened man's signature. He looked up and found Rosa watching him. Her expression was quiet and very kind, and it occurred to him in that moment, with the clarity that sometimes arrives in moments of significant change, that the thing happening to him regarding Rosa Hawthorne was not simply gratitude, though it was also gratitude, and it was not simply admiration, though it was also that. It was something older and more committed. It was the beginning of a feeling he had not allowed himself to have in many years, not since before the prison, not since before the darkness, not since he had last believed that the future was something a person could build toward rather than simply survive into. It was the beginning of love. He did not say this, obviously. It was 10:30 in the morning in a notary's office in Cuervo, New Mexico, and he had known her for approximately 14 hours, and he was, regardless of the warming happening in his interior landscape, still fundamentally a man who had been alone for a long time and had not yet learned to speak the language of the thing that was growing in him. But he looked at her, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that did not require language. Curtis Doyle and his 2 men arrived in Cuervo at approximately 11 o'clock, which gave Lionel Walker exactly 30 minutes of satisfaction before the situation became complicated again. He was in the street when they came in, because he had walked Rosa back toward her boarding house and had been standing outside in the sun watching her go inside, in the slightly dazed way of a man who is only gradually becoming aware of what is happening to him, when the sound of horses drew his attention to the eastern end of Main Street. He recognized Doyle immediately, a wide man on a dark horse with the look of someone who had spent years doing unpleasant things professionally and had arrived at a kind of settled comfort with it. The 2 men riding with him were younger, harder-faced, the kind of men hired for a specific purpose. They pulled up in the street. Doyle looked at Lionel. Lionel looked at Doyle. A handful of Cuervo's residents found reasons to be elsewhere. "Walker," Doyle said. "Doyle, I heard you have been busy." "I finished my business this morning," Lionel said. "The statement is sealed and it is going to Santa Fe. What you came to prevent is already done." He said this deliberately, because the truth was that if Doyle had arrived an hour earlier the morning might have gone differently, and he wanted Doyle to understand clearly that the trip had been wasted, because a man who knows his objective is gone has less reason to escalate. It was pragmatic rather than taunting. Doyle absorbed this with the expression of a man running a calculation. "That statement names me," he said. "It does. You understand where this puts me." "I understand where you put yourself," Lionel said. "When you lied to a judge, nothing in that statement is untrue." Doyle looked at him for a long moment. His hand was near his gun but not on it, which was a meaningful distinction. The 2 men with him were watching Doyle for direction, which told Lionel something useful about how independently motivated they were. "I have 3 men here," Doyle said. "You have 2 men who work for pay," Lionel corrected. "The question you want to ask yourself is whether what you are paying them covers this particular situation." He let that sit for a moment. "I have been in this territory for 11 years. The men who have tried me in the street are mostly dead or missing, and none of them succeeded. That is public information." He paused. "This does not have to end in anyone's blood. The statement is already sent. The damage to you, such as it is already done. Riding away now costs you nothing additional." One of the hired men glanced at his companion. A small, eloquent glance. Doyle sat very still on his horse for what felt like a long time. The street was silent. The desert wind moved a piece of paper along the edge of the boardwalk. The sky was the enormous saturated blue of a New Mexico morning. Rosa's voice came from behind Lionel, calm and clear. "Mr. Doyle, I am the person who helped draft that statement, and I want you to know that copies of it are going to 3 different destinations in Santa Fe and Albuquerque, so destroying any single document will not accomplish what you hope. The only productive path forward is the legal one. You might consider finding a good attorney." There was a beat of silence. Then one of the hired men said, "She has a point," and turned his horse. The other one, after a moment, did the same. Doyle looked at Lionel for another long moment. There was something in his face that was not quite defeat but was adjacent to it, the particular expression of a man who has arrived at a moment and found that it does not contain what he expected. "This is not finished," he said, but there was no real conviction in it. "It is finished today," Lionel said, "and if you are sensible, it will stay finished." Doyle turned his horse and rode back out of town the way he had come. Lionel watched him until the sound of hooves faded, and then he let out a slow breath and became aware that Rosa was standing about 6 feet behind him, and that he was extremely glad she was there and also somewhat aware that he should address the fact that he had told her to go inside. He turned. "You said copies were going to 3 different locations," he said. "I said that, yes." "Are they?" She met his eyes steadily. "They will be by the end of the day. I fully intend to make it true by making it true." A small pause. "Did it work?" He looked at her. Her chin was slightly up, in the way of a person who has done a bold thing and is not entirely sure it was wise and is not going to show that uncertainty until it is safe to do so. The morning sun was in her hair. She was magnificent. "It worked," he said. The smile that broke across her face was the same one he had first seen in the Silver Spur. The full one. The real one. The one that had stopped him in a doorway with a gun in his hand, and rearranged something fundamental in the architecture of his intentions. He felt it again now, that precise quality of forgetting, all the weight and the darkness and the long years of carrying things alone, just for a moment, simply gone, erased by the brightness of her. He walked with her to get the copies made. There was a man in Cuervo with a printing press who had 3 sheets of copy paper and a willingness to be helpful for a modest fee. By early afternoon there were indeed 3 copies of Wendell Pratt's statement, addressed to different officials in Santa Fe and Albuquerque, deposited in the mail, which in 1882 traveled by stage and was not fast but was reliable. In the days that followed, Lionel Walker did not leave Cuervo. He told himself this was because there were practical reasons to stay, because he wanted to make sure Pratt did not have second thoughts, because he wanted to confirm that the copies had gotten onto the stage properly, because the horse needed a few days' rest after the long ride. These were all technically true and also not remotely the reason. The reason was Rosa. She was busy in those days with the school. The building on Mesa Street turned out to require considerable work before it would be suitable for children to learn in, and Rosa threw herself into that work with the same organized energy she applied to everything, making lists, negotiating with the carpenter, determining what furniture and materials could be sourced locally, and what would need to be ordered. Lionel found himself, without having made any conscious decision to do so, helping. He was good with his hands in the way that men of his background often were, and he was useful with the heavier work, moving materials, repairing the boards in the floor, rehanging the door that had dropped on its hinges. He was also useful in less physical ways, because his reputation in Cuervo had the particular effect of making people cooperative, and various residents who had been somewhat vague about their willingness to contribute to a new school found clarity on the subject when Rosa arrived accompanied by Lionel Walker. She noticed this and commented on it precisely once, saying, "You are using your reputation for good, which is either redemption or irony, and I cannot decide which." He thought about it for a moment and said, "Maybe both." She laughed. In the evenings they would sit on the steps of the boarding house in the cooling desert air, or sometimes at the Silver Spur again, and they would talk. He began to understand the full shape of her, the thinking person and the feeling person, and the person she had been before the Albuquerque school board had delivered its particular small injustice, the one that had made her pack a single trunk and get on a stage to a town she had never been to. He told her piece by piece the things from his own past that he had been carrying. Not as confession, but as the kind of telling that happens when a person finally feels that the person they are telling will receive it without using it against them, which is an extremely specific kind of trust, and not one he came to easily. She listened. She did not make it smaller than it was or larger than it was. She simply heard it, and when she responded to what he had actually said rather than to a version of it that was easier or more comfortable. And it was this quality, as much as any other single thing, that made him fall further and more completely than he had imagined was still possible for him. On the fifth evening, they were sitting on the boarding house steps in the warm dark, and Rosa was talking about the school and what she wanted it to be, her voice alive with it, the particular animation that people have when they are describing something they believe in. And Lionel was watching her and only half listening to the specific words, because the specific words were secondary to the experience of watching a person be fully alive in their purpose, which was something he had not seen for a long time and which moved him enormously. She stopped mid-sentence. "You are not listening to the actual content of what I am saying," she observed. "No. What are you listening to?" He was quiet for a moment, deciding how honest to be. He decided on fully honest, because that was what she deserved and because the old habit of guardedness, which had served him well and cost him much, felt increasingly like something he was ready to put down. "I am watching you," he said, "and thinking that you are the most extraordinary person I have met in a very long time, and that whatever comes next for me, I would very much like it to involve being near you, and that I do not know how to say that with any elegance because I am quite thoroughly out of practice." Rosa looked at him. In the darkness her expression was very serious, and for a moment he could not read it, and he felt the old familiar contraction of a person bracing for loss. Then she said, "Lionel, the most feared man in the New Mexico territory, just told me he is out of practice at being romantic. This is the most endearing thing I have heard in at least a decade." "I was not trying to be endearing," he said, slightly affronted. "I know," she said. "That is what makes it endearing." And then, with the directness that was one of the things he loved most about her, she reached over and took his hand and held it, and they sat like that in the warm dark with the stars wheeling enormously overhead, and it was one of the simplest and most significant moments of his adult life. The following 2 weeks were a kind of happiness he had not had vocabulary for. He helped with the school. She taught him patience, not by lecturing him on the subject but simply by being patient in his presence until it became contagious. He taught her, or rather demonstrated, certain practical facts about the territory that she received with interest and absolutely no deference, which he found both frustrating and deeply attractive. They walked in the evenings. They ate meals together. They argued occasionally, because Rosa held opinions with a firmness that was not going to defer to his preference for a quiet life, and he was not a man who had ever learned to simply agree with things he did not agree with. The arguments were not damaging. They were the kind that happens between people who respect each other's intelligence enough to fight fairly, and they usually ended with both of them having modified their position slightly, which was, as Rosa pointed out, actually the point of having opinions, to refine them through encounter with other people's honest disagreement. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after he had arrived in Cuervo planning to collect on a reckoning, and instead found something he had not known he was looking for. They had been standing in the doorway of the school building, which was nearly ready, and she had turned to him with the morning light behind her, and a streak of white paint on her cheek from where she had been working on the window frames, and he had reached out and wiped the paint away with his thumb, and the touch had stopped them both, and the pause that followed was exactly long enough for him to understand what she was waiting for. It was a quiet kiss, neither tentative nor demanding, the kind that carries the weight of everything that came before it. She put her hand against his chest and looked up at him. "About time," she said. He laughed. It surprised him as much as his laugh always seemed to surprise the people who heard it, because it was not the sort of sound that the most feared man in the territory was expected to produce, warm and genuine and slightly unguarded. "About time," he agreed. 3 weeks after that, a letter arrived from Santa Fe. Judge Harrison Alcott had received the statement. The official record in the matter of the territory versus Lionel Walker had been reviewed and revised. The conviction was vacated. The record was cleared. Lionel read the letter twice at the kitchen table of Mrs. Alvarado's boarding house, while Rosa sat across from him with her hands folded and her eyes steady on his face. When he put the letter down, there was a long silence. "It is done," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked up at her. The darkness that had lived behind his eyes, the constant, subtle, defensive darkness of a person carrying an unjust record, was still there, or the habit of it was, but something beneath it had released, like a knot finally undone, and the space left behind was not empty but waiting to be filled with something new. "I need to think about what I do now," he said. "Who I am now." Rosa nodded. "You have time," she said. "You are 30 years old, Lionel. You are not starting from nothing. You have skills and capability and a reputation that, however double-edged, is real. And you are in a town that is growing and needs capable people, and you are in a school that needs a roof repaired on the east side before the winter comes." She paused. "And you are sitting across from a woman who would appreciate it very much if your plans for who you are now included staying in Cuervo." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you asking me to stay?" "I am stating my preference and leaving you the freedom to make your own choice," she said, "which is how I prefer to operate. But yes, I am asking you to stay." He stayed. It was not a dramatic decision. There was no single moment of declaration. He simply stopped thinking of Cuervo as a temporary place and started thinking of it as his place, which was a distinction that most people who have not spent a long time without a home do not fully appreciate. He took work with the town marshal, whose name was Samuel Croft, a fair and capable man who had the good sense to understand that having Lionel Walker as an unofficial deputy was worth considerably more than whatever he might have to pay him. Lionel's job, in practice, was less about violence than about its prevention, because his presence was usually enough to make the kind of trouble that visited frontier towns reconsider its itinerary. He was good at it, and he found in it a version of purpose that the years of solitary reckoning-seeking had not provided. The school opened in October of 1882, on a cool, bright morning with most of Cuervo present. Rosa stood at the door in a new dress, dark blue this time, and welcomed every child by name, because she had already memorized them, all 23 of them, in the 2 weeks before opening, having introduced herself to every family in town and made it her business to know who they were. Lionel stood at the back of the crowd and watched her work, and the feeling that moved through him had no name he had previously used for a feeling. It was not happiness exactly, though happiness was in it. It was something larger and more settled. It was the feeling of a person who has arrived somewhere after a very long journey and recognized, with surprise and certainty, that this is the place. He asked her to marry him in November. He did it badly the first time, which was to say he chose a moment that was logical rather than romantic, which was at the end of a long evening when they were both tired from the week's work, and he had been thinking about it so consistently that the thought finally just came out of him without ceremony. "I want to marry you, Rosa." She turned from where she was standing by the window, and the expression on her face was complex and entirely readable to him now. She was moved and trying not to show it completely, and also slightly amused. "That was not your best effort," she said. "No," he agreed. "I am aware. Try again." He stood up. He was not, by nature or training, a man comfortable with declarative vulnerability, but he had been practicing it, slowly and with difficulty, in the weeks they had been together, and he understood that this was a moment that required it fully. "Rosa," he said, "I have spent more years than I care to count being alone, and calling it preference when it was actually just the only arrangement I knew how to survive. I came to this town carrying 11 years of grievances, and I sat down at your table instead of doing the thing I had ridden 200 miles to do, and every day since then I have been more grateful for that than I know how to say. You are the most honest, most capable, most genuinely courageous person I have ever known, and the world you are building in this town is a better world than the one I rode through to get here, and I want very much to be part of it. I want to be part of it with you. Will you marry me?" Rosa looked at him for a long moment, and her eyes were bright. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes, you great difficult man." He covered the distance between them in 3 steps and held her, and she held him back with her arms around his neck and her face against his shoulder. And outside, the November stars were doing their extravagant thing over the desert. And inside the boarding house there was nothing but warmth, and the sound of 2 people who have found each other after separate long journeys breathing the same air. They were married in December, on a Saturday, in the small adobe church at the edge of town that Father Morales kept with a dedication that was touching given the size of his congregation. Rosa wore her mother's earrings, small silver ones that she had carried in her trunk from Albuquerque, and a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Alvarado and 2 other women from town had helped her make in the preceding weeks in a series of evenings that had been, Rosa said, among the most pleasant she had spent since coming to Cuervo. Lionel wore a dark coat that was new, purchased from the general store specifically for the occasion, which he had felt slightly self-conscious about until Rosa told him he looked distinguished, at which point he had stopped feeling self-conscious and felt something considerably warmer instead. The church was full. This surprised him because he was not a man who had imagined having a community, but Cuervo had accepted him in the way that frontier towns sometimes accepted people, with practical clarity. He was useful and he was fair, and he did not cause the trouble he was capable of preventing, and that was sufficient. The people who came to watch them marry came because they genuinely wished them well, which was a thing he had not expected, and which hit him with a force he was not prepared for. Marshall Croft stood up with him. Rosa's friend from Santa Fe, a woman named Esperanza who had written her the letter that brought her to Cuervo, had come up for the occasion and stood beside her. Father Morales read the words in both English and Spanish, which was Rosa's request, and which seemed to Lionel the exactly right way to do it. When it was done and Lionel Walker kissed Rosa Hawthorne, now Rosa Walker, in the small adobe church with the winter light coming in through the clear glass windows, there was a sound from the assembled people of Cuervo that was part applause and part something else, a collective acknowledgement of the particular rightness of this specific thing, and it was the kind of sound that a person carries with them for the rest of their life. The winter that followed was the first winter Lionel Walker had spent in a home. He did not use that word immediately, because it was a word with a weight he had to work up to, but by January he had begun to understand it. The small house at the edge of town that they had taken the lease on, and which Rosa had made habitable with a combination of practical effort and what he could only describe as an instinct for warmth, the house was a home. He was in it with another person. He came back to it at the end of the day, and there was light in the window and a smell from the kitchen and a specific quality of presence that was Rosa's, that he had begun to orient toward the way a plant orients toward sun, not dramatically, not consciously, just fundamentally. She continued teaching. He continued working with the marshal. These were not glamorous arrangements. They were the daily architecture of an ordinary life, and he had not understood until he had won that an ordinary life was not a lesser thing. It was the thing. The rest of it, the reputation and the reckoning and the long, dangerous years, those had been the preliminary. This was the actual story. In March, something happened that was both wonderful and terrifying, which was that Rosa told him she thought she might be expecting. He sat very still when she said it in the kitchen of their house with the early spring sun coming in. "Are you all right?" she asked, watching him with that clear-eyed attention. "Yes," he said. "I am." He looked at her. "Are you?" "I think so," she said. "I am frightened and also very glad, which I suspect is the appropriate response." "Yes," he said, it was the appropriate response. He was also frightened and also very glad, and the combination of the two was so new and so large that he had to sit with it for a moment before he could do anything else. He took her hand across the kitchen table. "We will figure it out," he said, "whatever it requires." "I know," she said simply, without hedging, the way she always said things she fully meant. The pregnancy proceeded through the spring and into the summer with the ordinary mixture of difficulty and beauty that such things contain. Rosa did not stop teaching until June, when the school term ended for the summer anyway, and she applied to the question of impending parenthood with the same organized intelligence she applied to everything, reading what there was to read, consulting the town's physician, Mrs. Elena Reyes, who had come to Cuervo 2 years earlier and was the first woman physician most residents had ever encountered, and who Rosa had befriended immediately. Lionel was attentive in the way that he had come to understand was required, which was less about dramatic gestures and more about the quiet, consistent business of being reliably present. He noticed what she needed before she said it, most of the time because he had become a student of her in the way he had once been a student of terrain and weather, with thoroughness and close attention and a genuine desire to understand. He also, in these months, came to terms with things from his past that he had been carrying. Not all of it, because some things take longer than others, but enough. The cleared record had done something he had not fully anticipated, which was to open the possibility of understanding himself differently, not as a man defined by what had been done to him, but as a man with choices before him. He wrote a letter to a man in Missouri who had been his father's friend, a man who had known his mother, and received a reply that told him things he had not known and some things he had guessed, and the correspondence was brief, but it was something, a thread back to a past that was not entirely dark. He also, in June of that year, encountered Curtis Doyle again, not in the explosive way of their street confrontation in September. Doyle came to Cuervo alone, without his hired men, and asked to speak with Lionel privately, which was either brave or desperate depending on one's interpretation. They met in the marshal's office with Samuel Croft present as a neutral witness. Doyle had received a letter from a judge in Albuquerque. The statement Pratt had provided had been comprehensive, and the correction it entailed implicated Doyle specifically. He was facing a charge of perjury and potentially more, and he had come, it emerged, not to threaten but to ask something. He asked whether Lionel would speak on his behalf regarding the possibility of leniency, in exchange for Doyle providing his own statement confirming and expanding on what Pratt had said. What he was offering, in practical terms, was the completion of the record, a second corroborating voice that would make the correction ironclad. Lionel sat with this for a long time, long enough that the silence in the marshal's office became uncomfortable for everyone except him. Then he said yes. He said yes because Rosa had told him, in the early weeks of their marriage, that the thing that separated justice from revenge was the willingness to take it no further than necessary, and that a man who could testify in favor of leniency for a person who had wronged him, when that person was genuinely and practically useful to the cause of the correct record, was a man who had learned something important about the difference between power and vengeance. He had argued with her about it at the time. She had, as she usually did when she was correct, simply waited for him to arrive at the same place through his own route. Doyle gave his statement. The record became as complete and as clear as it was possible to make it. Doyle received a reduced charge and a fine and 5 years of circumstances he had to improve himself within. Pratt, in Santa Fe, was dealing with consequences from multiple directions that Lionel had no need to track or monitor. The thing was done. The summer moved forward. Rosa grew and was careful and was sometimes tired and was never diminished, because that was not something that happened to Rosa Walker. On the 15th of August, 1883, their son was born. It was a long and difficult labor, which Elena Reyes managed with the competence that had made her reputation in Cuervo, and Lionel spent most of it in the manner of expectant fathers in that era, which was outside the room, which was one of the more genuinely terrible experiences of his life, not from danger but from helplessness, which he had always found more difficult than danger. When Elena Reyes opened the door and said, "You have a healthy boy, and Rosa is asking for you," he crossed the threshold with a speed that he did not associate with his usual manner. Rosa was exhausted and radiant in the specific way that is unique to that particular combination of circumstances, propped against the pillows with the small bundled weight of their son in her arms. Lionel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his child. He had not prepared, he discovered, for this. He had prepared as well as he knew how. He had read the pamphlets Elena Reyes had given him. He had built the cradle himself. He had had all the logical and practical preparations. But there is no preparation for the actual encounter with the fact of one's child. And Lionel Walker, who had not cried since he was a young man in Missouri, felt his eyes fill and did not do anything to stop it. Rosa reached out and touched his face, and she was smiling, and he put his hand over hers. "Hello," she said softly, the word directed at the baby rather than at him, in the tone of someone beginning a conversation they expect to go on for a very long time. They named him Thomas James Walker. Thomas for Rosa's father, who had been a good man and was missed, James for Lionel's, who had been a complicated man and was missed in a different way. Thomas was a loud, robust, thoroughly opinionated infant who made clear from his first days that he intended to be exactly as much of a presence as his mother, and had inherited from his father a certain quality of stillness that made other people pay attention. He was, in short, completely himself, which was the best thing a person could be. The school reopened in September and Rosa went back in October, when Thomas was 7 weeks old and sleeping in the back room in a basket that Lionel carried to school and back every day without being asked to, which Rosa noted and never made a fuss over because she understood that he expressed certain feelings through action rather than declaration and had long since stopped expecting him to declare what he was perfectly willing to demonstrate. Cuervo grew. The town grew, the school grew, their life grew. By 1884, there were 31 children in Rosa's school, and she had petitioned the town council, with Lionel sitting in the back of the council meeting with the particular posture of a man whose presence is itself an argument, for an additional room and a second teacher. The council, having been provided with a thorough and rigorously documented proposal, and having also noted the man in the back of the room, approved the expansion. The second teacher was a young man named David Oropsa, who had trained in Albuquerque, and who shared Rosa's commitment to an education that honored the full heritage of the territory's children, which in New Mexico meant both the Spanish-speaking families who had been there for generations and the Anglo families who had come more recently, and all the variations and combinations that existed between those categories, which were many. Lionel found in these years that the identity he had built on the foundation of reputation and fear was giving way to something different, not less solid but differently constructed. He was still capable. He was still dangerous, in the sense that a man does not forget what he knows, and occasionally situations arose that required the skills he carried. But he was also, increasingly, a person known for other things, for fairness, for showing up when something needed doing, for being the person that other people called when a situation required the combination of capability and judgment that he had in fact always possessed and had simply been directing, for many years, toward ends that did not serve him or anyone else particularly well. He sat on the town council by 1885. He did not seek the position. It was offered by Samuel Croft, who was stepping back from certain community roles, and he accepted it because Rosa thought he should and because he had learned, slowly and with evidence, that Rosa's assessment of what he was capable of was more reliable than his own. Thomas turned to and began walking, and then running, and then climbing things that no 2-year-old had a reasonable mandate to climb. And Lionel spent a significant portion of the autumn of 1885 following his son around with the focused attention that a man of his particular skill set brings to the problem of a determined and fearless toddler in a frontier town. Rosa watched this from the schoolroom window on more than one occasion and laughed, which was a laugh of a slightly different quality than the first laugh he had ever heard from her, the one that had stopped him in a doorway and rearranged his intentions, but it was in the same family. It was still full and unguarded and entirely itself. It was still the thing that could reach into the machinery of whatever he was carrying and simply, thoroughly, stop it. In the spring of 1886, Rosa told him she was expecting again. This time he was not still with surprise, because he had had some indication from the preceding days that this might be forthcoming, and he was also simply better than he had been before at receiving large things without going rigid with them. He held her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and her cheek and her mouth, and she put her arms around his waist, and they stood like that in the kitchen of their house with Thomas asleep in the next room and the spring evening light coming in through the window. And it was one of the many moments that he had begun to understand were the actual substance of a life. The summer of 1886 brought a few developments beyond the domestic, because the territory of New Mexico was in the process of certain political and social changes that had implications for the people in it. There were debates about statehood, which were both earnest and contentious. There were ongoing negotiations with the Mescalero Apache people, whose land rights had been and continued to be treated with a disregard that Rosa was vocal about, and Lionel had his own opinions on. Opinions informed by years of moving through the territory with the kind of attention that teaches a person something about what is actually there and who it actually belongs to. Rosa wrote letters to the territorial governor. She organized meetings. She did these things in the way she did everything, which was with research and clarity and absolute refusal to be discouraged by the slowness of institutions, which had always been slow, and which required persistent pressure to move at all. Lionel supported this work in the concrete ways available to him, attending meetings, signing his name to petitions, and occasionally making it clear to people who attempted to discourage Rosa's advocacy that they had badly miscalculated whose wife they were talking about. The winter of 1886 brought their second child, who arrived on the 3rd of December in considerably less dramatic fashion than Thomas had, which Elena Reyes attributed to the efficiency of experienced parenthood and Rosa attributed to the child being more considerate than her brother, which was a characterization she maintained even after the baby in question demonstrated within approximately 4 months that she was every bit as determined and energetic as Thomas, possibly more so. They named her Clara Margaret Walker. Clara was Rosa's mother's name, the one she had carried from Santa Fe in those silver earrings, and Margaret for Elena Reyes, who had become in the preceding years genuinely family, the kind that is chosen rather than born into, which Rosa held to be the more durable kind. Clara was loud and specific in her preferences from the beginning, and she had her father's eyes, the gray of them that Rosa had once described as the color of the sky before a change in weather. She also had, Rosa noted with a satisfaction that Lionel found deeply funny, her father's instinct for silence as power, which was to say that when Clara stopped talking, people paid attention. Thomas adored her with the ferocity of an older sibling who has never been given any reason not to adore, and the sight of him at 3.5, carefully showing his baby sister the proper way to hold a spoon or the name of every horse at the livery, was the kind of thing that Lionel filed in the part of his memory that he intended to live near for the rest of his life. The years moved forward in the way of good years, which is to say they moved in a way that one notices is good while it is happening, and not only in retrospect. The territory of New Mexico was changing, becoming denser with settlement, more connected to the east by rail and telegraph, more complicated in all the ways that increasing connection makes things complicated. Cuervo changed with it and remained itself, which is the achievement of small towns that have been built on something real. Rosa's school expanded again, to 3 rooms by 1888, with a teaching staff of 3 including herself, and a curriculum that she had spent years refining, and that had become something of a model, visited by officials from the territorial government who wanted to understand how it was that the children of Cuervo were learning with such evident engagement and producing such coherent writing. Rosa explained, on more than one occasion and to more than one official, that children learn when they are treated as full human beings, whose entire heritage and experience is relevant to their education, rather than as vessels to be filled with approved content. This was not, she acknowledged, a revolutionary insight. It was, however, one that was inconsistently applied, and she intended to apply it as consistently as humanly possible for as long as she was teaching. The officials nodded and went back to their offices, and some of what she said made it into the territory's educational discussions, slowly, incompletely, but noticeably. Lionel watched her and thought about what she had said to him on the night they met, about the shortage of people willing to think carefully. She was not experiencing that shortage herself. She had enough careful thinking for considerably more than one person, and she was distributing it, through her school and her advocacy and her letters and her presence, with the generosity of someone who understands that thinking is not a finite resource. In 1889, Thomas started school. His mother taught him, which was both appropriate and a situation that required the occasional negotiation of a particular kind of boundary, because Thomas Walker had inherited his father's tendency not to defer and his mother's tendency to be right, which was, Rosa noted, a combination that was going to require some patience from everyone, including his teachers. She was his teacher. She had all the patience in the world. He was also, she acknowledged privately to Lionel, one of the most genuinely curious children she had encountered in her years of teaching, which was a trait she felt no obligation to be modest about, given that she was primarily responsible for having read to him every evening since he was 4 months old, and having taken his questions, every question, at every age, with complete seriousness. Lionel turned 40 in 1891. He did not make a fuss about this. Rosa made a fuss about it on his behalf, which was to say she organized a dinner with their friends, which was a larger group than he had ever expected to have. Elena Reyes and her husband, who had come to Cuervo by then, David Oropsa, who had become genuinely a friend in the years of working alongside Rosa, Samuel Croft, who had retired from the marshal's position, but not from the habit of showing up when needed. A handful of others who had been woven into the fabric of their life in Cuervo over the preceding decade. He sat at the head of the table and looked at the room, and found it almost impossibly full. Not just with people, though the people were the point, but with the evidence of a life that had been built deliberately and carefully out of things that were true and things that mattered. Rosa sat beside him, as she always did, and she leaned over at one point during the evening and said quietly, against his ear, "Are you all right?" He turned to look at her. 40 years old, and still she could stop him with a look. Still her presence rearranged his interior landscape with the thoroughness that it had on the first night in the Silver Spur. Still, her laugh was the thing that reached into whatever he was carrying and put it down. "I am very well," he said. Unexpectedly and completely well. She smiled and reached under the table and took his hand and held it. Clara was 5 that year and had moved from adoring her brother to vigorously arguing with him, and occasionally both simultaneously, which Thomas bore with a patience that somewhat surprised both his parents, until they recognized that he was doing exactly what he had watched his father do in situations that required forbearance, which was to become very still and quiet and wait for the other person to finish, and then say one thing clearly, which was usually correct. Rosa saw this one afternoon and had to go to the kitchen so that the children would not see her cry, because it was the kind of thing that is too large for a person to contain in a normal way. She told Lionel about it that evening in their bedroom after the children were asleep, and he listened to her describe it and felt that same quality of fullness that he had felt at the birthday dinner, the sense of a life overflowing with something good. "He watches you," Rosa said. "He has always watched you. He does not tell you, because he is 8 and because he takes after you considerably, but he watches how you move through the world and he is filing it away." Lionel was quiet for a moment. "I hope," he said, "that the parts he files away are the ones from now, not the ones from before." "You are the sum of all of it," Rosa said. "The man you were before is how I understand the man you are now. The darkness is part of what makes the light visible." She looked at him steadily. "And Thomas is going to understand that too when he is old enough. The whole story, because you are going to tell it to him. And it is not going to be a story about a man defined by his dark past. It is going to be a story about a man who walked through it and came out the other side." He looked at her. "You are always certain about things I am not certain about." "That is my function," she said with a small smile. "One of them," he said. The smile widened. "One of them," she agreed. The territory of New Mexico became the state of New Mexico officially in January of 1912. But for Lionel and Rosa Walker, the significant territory had always been the one they inhabited together, the bounded and living space of a shared life, which was not a state or a territory in any official sense, but was governed by its own laws, which were honesty and presence and the willingness to be known. But the years of the 1890s and the early 1900s are not to be skimmed, because they were the years that contained the bulk of living, the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of days that constitutes a life actually lived rather than simply survived. In 1893, Rosa had a third pregnancy that ended in loss early, before they had told anyone. It was a grief that they bore together, which is to say it was a grief that neither of them bore alone, which is not the same as bearing it easily. They were careful with each other in the weeks after, careful in the way of people who are aware of the other person's pain, and are moving close to it without putting weight on it, and the carefulness was its own form of love. In 1895, they had another son, whom they named Samuel, for Samuel Croft, who had been present and reliable for so many years, and who came to the christening with the expression of a man thoroughly unaccustomed to being honored and thoroughly glad of it. Samuel Walker was quieter than his older siblings, watchful and sweet, with his mother's dark eyes and a quality of attentiveness that made people feel, from a very young age, that he was genuinely interested in them, which he was. The school in 1896 had enrolled 62 children, and required 4 teachers and a proper building that Rosa had spent 2 years fundraising for and organizing and advocating toward. And when the new building was dedicated on a September morning with the whole town present, the mayor of Cuervo, who had been a farmer's son when Rosa first arrived and was now 22 and had been educated in her school, gave a speech in which he said that the school had changed not just the children who attended it but the whole character of the town, because a town that teaches its children well is a town that believes in its own future. Rosa stood next to Lionel during the speech with 3-year-old Samuel on her hip, and Clara and Thomas standing in front of them, Clara upright and attentive, and Thomas slightly fidgeting in the way of 13-year-old boys. And Lionel had his hand at Rosa's back. And the morning was bright, and the desert air was clean and cool. And he thought of the man he had been in the doorway of the Silver Spur 14 years ago. The man with the gun in his hand and the reckoning in his chest. And the distance between that man and this moment was not simply time, but transformation. Not the dramatic transformation of a single choice, but the slow and daily transformation of a life being built one day at a time toward something worth having. He thought of her laugh, the impossible, unguarded, full laugh that had stopped him in a doorway when nothing had stopped him in 11 years. He had not known, standing there, that it was the sound of his life changing. He had not known that the sound of a woman laughing without fear in a room full of fear was the sound of a door opening into everything that came after. He knew it now. Thomas went east for school in 1901, to Proper University in New Mexico's territorial capital, which Rosa had prepared him for with 10 years of rigorous and loving education, and which Lionel had prepared him for by being, consistently, a demonstration that education and capability were not in contradiction with strength. He came back holidays and wrote letters that were long and specific, and showed that he was his mother's son in every way that mattered. Clara took over running certain aspects of the school's organization when she was 15, not because she was asked to, but because she identified inefficiencies and addressed them, which was the most Rosa-like thing she had ever done and also the most Lionel-like thing, the stillness followed by decisive action. Rosa noted this overlap and found it one of the more profound satisfactions of her life. Samuel grew up quiet and kind and became, by the time he was in school himself, the child who befriended the ones who were left out, which again required no instruction from his parents, because it was simply the expression of who he was, though they had certainly provided an environment in which such a character could flourish. Lionel Walker, who had been the most feared man in the New Mexico territory, turned 50 in 1901 in a house full of children and neighbors and the accumulated richness of 20 years of ordinary, extraordinary life. He had laugh lines. He had not expected to acquire laugh lines. They were Rosa's contribution to his face, earned slowly and genuinely, the physical evidence of thousands of moments when something she said or did or was had made him forget whatever he had been carrying. She was 48 and still taught, though with a slightly reduced schedule now that the school had sufficient staff, and her presence in Cuervo was the kind of presence that a town grows around, essential and quietly structural, the way certain foundations are invisible because they are holding everything up. He walked home with her one evening in October, their hands loosely linked in the way of people for whom physical ease with each other has been 20 years in the making, and the desert sky was doing its evening performance, orange and pink and the deep blue coming in from the east, and the smell of sage and dust was everywhere, and she was talking about something Thomas had written in his latest letter about a woman he had met, and her voice had that quality of animation that it still had. After all the years, whenever she was talking about something that pleased her, he stopped walking, she stopped with him. What? He turned to her. In the evening light she was beautiful in the way of a life fully inhabited, the kind of beauty that does not diminish with years but shifts register, becoming more itself rather than less. I have been thinking, he said, about the night in the Silver Spur. She looked at him with a slight smile. The night you arrived to commit an act of intimidation and I talked you out of it. The night you laughed, he said, and I forgot everything else. The smile softened. Lionel, I have thought about it many times. I was standing in that doorway with everything I had been carrying for 11 years and you laughed and it was just gone. All of it. Just for a moment. And in that moment there was nothing but the sound of you. She was watching him with her eyes very bright. I did not know then what it was, he said, but I know now. It was the sound of a person who was not afraid of the world being herself in it. It was the most alive thing I had heard in years. He paused. It was the beginning of everything. Rosa reached up and put her hand against his cheek. the way she had on the night their first child was born, with the simple directness of a person who has long since stopped calculating what to do and simply does what the moment asks of her. "You," she said softly, "are the most difficult and the best thing that ever happened to me." Covered her hand with his own. "You are the thing that made possible every good thing that has happened since," he said. "The cleared record, the children, the life. All of it starts with you sitting in a saloon and laughing without fear and making me sit down." She was smiling now fully, the full unguarded smile that had first stopped him and had been stopping him ever since, the smile from the same family as the laugh, bright and honest and entirely unafraid. "To be fair," she said, "you made that choice yourself." With considerable encouragement, he said. "I prefer to call it a gentle redirect," she said. And then she laughed, the real laugh, full and bright, and he felt it happen again exactly as it always had and always would, the weight in his chest dissolving, the darkness going light, every reckoning and every grievance and every carefully maintained defense simply releasing, like a hand opening, like a life opening. They walked home in the evening light, through the town they had built together in the way that two people who are committed to something larger than themselves build it, not with drama and not with declaration but with daily and deliberate presence, with teaching and showing up and being honest and choosing, every day, the life in front of them over the damage behind them. Their house had lights in the windows. It always had lights in the windows. That was Rosa's contribution to the domestic ritual of their life. She lit the lamps before dark because she liked the look of a lit house from the outside, liked the way it read as inhabited and warm in the landscape of the evening. And Lionel had come to love this about their house the same way he loved everything about their life, with the specific and grateful attention of a person who knows what the absence of it felt like. Thomas had written to say the woman in his letter, whose name was Amelia, was someone he would like to bring home for Christmas. Clara had already written to ask whether she could take over the second classroom full-time in the spring when Mrs. Castillo retired. Samuel had, that afternoon, brought home a small dog that had been following him from school, and was at that moment waiting on the porch with the dog, and the expression of a child who has prepared a comprehensive case for keeping it. Lionel and Rosa walked through the gate and Samuel jumped up from the porch steps, the dog at his heels, saying, "Before you say anything, I have thought about this carefully." And Rosa burst out laughing again, because her youngest child had, quite clearly and very specifically, inherited her approach to presenting arguments. And Lionel stood in the doorway of his home in the warm October evening, surrounded by the sounds of his life, and thought that this was what came after. This was what was on the other side of the reckoning, the thing he had not been able to build toward because he had not been able to imagine it. This was it, all of it. The laugh and the schoolchildren and the cleared record and the husband and the wife and the boy with the dog and the evening light. This was what a life could be when a person sat down instead of doing the other thing. He went inside. He was home.